Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The United States has stepped up pressure on Venezuela with its largest buildup of warships in the region and the interception of oil tankers in international waters. So far, Washington has seized 2 vessels carrying Venezuelan crude and under the banner of counter-narcotics operations has conducted strikes on ships that have reportedly resulted in more than 100 deaths. On Monday, President Trump again raised the prospect of military action, saying it would be smart for President Nicolas Maduro to step down. So what is Washington's endgame in Venezuela? What lies behind this intensifying pressure on the South American country? And is the crisis heading toward a more serious military confrontation? Join us for discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Well, joining me today are Jorge Heine, former Chilean ambassador to China and author of The Non-Aligned World, Striking Out in an Era of Great Power Competition, and now a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute. Benjamin Norton, founder and editor-in-chief of the Geopolitical Economy Report, and Professor Jiang Shixue, director of the Center for Latin American Studies at Shanghai University. Welcome to the show. So, Ambassador, I will start with you. Over the past 2 weeks, we have seen the U.S., intercepting and seizing 2 oil tankers carrying Venezuela crude, with both operations led by the U.S. Coast Guard and the U.S. sanctions enforcement. Of course, there's also strikes against the so-called, drug dealers over there. What do you make of the U.S. campaign, the pressure on Venezuela?
Yes. The first thing I would like to say is that now with this essentially naval blockade on oil tankers coming in and out of Venezuela, it is de facto a declaration of war. It's very, unclear that Venezuela represents any kind of danger to the United States. In fact, it represents no danger at all. The argument that was originally presented that there was fentanyl trafficking from Venezuela to the United States has been debunked. No boat has ever been seized in the Caribbean with fentanyl. That's number one. Number two, the fact is that what is coming out now more and more, that the end game of this is regime change in Venezuela to get rid of the current government headed by President Maduro. Now, why is that, and why Venezuela at this point? I would argue that this has nothing to do with international affairs and everything to do with domestic politics. What we have is a situation in which President Trump and Secretary of State Rubio want to appeal to their base, to the MAGA base in particular, because they supported President Trump in 2024. And now they see many of their competitors being deported. 90% of deportees in the United States this year are Latin Americans. Many of them are Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, Cubans. So the base is quite unhappy. And what they want to do is to give them the head of President Maduro on a platter. That is what this is really all about. It's not about drugs. It's not about anything else. That's the real end game.
Interesting. Professor Jiang Shixue, you have been following the development of this region for all your academic life, let's say. How do you characterize the U.S. campaign against Venezuela? Are you surprised as, or even puzzled, and many people feel about these U.S. moves?
Well, since Chavez came to power in 1999, some countries like Venezuela and others have been holding this kind of banner of anti-U.S. hegemonism. So the U.S. is not very happy about Venezuela. I would point out that the U.S. has been imposing all kinds of sanctions against Venezuela. And now Trump just wants to overthrow the government of Maduro. As Ambassador Heine just mentioned, just want a kind of a regime change. So this is a kind of imperialist action, okay? Yes, I would like to point out that within Venezuela, there are kinds of crises. political crisis, economic crisis, but that has nothing to do with the U.S. Okay, so the U.S. just wants to overthrow an anti-U.S. government. That's what Trump wants to do. So let's see what will happen in the end of the day.
Well, Ben, I mean, you are from the U.S. What's your understanding? What's your interpretation? Of the U.S. Actions here. Is there any legality? Is there any legitimacy in terms of seizing foreign oil tankers or striking the small boats? Of course, accused of drug dealings.
No, there's no legitimacy whatsoever. In fact, some senators who have access to U.S. intelligence or lack thereof, like Rand Paul, who's actually a Republican, have come out and said that there's absolutely no proof whatsoever that these boats that have been repeatedly struck and destroyed and with over 100 people killed by the U.S. government, there's no evidence whatsoever they were trafficking drugs. Even if they were trafficking drugs, the U.S. government cannot simply kill these foreigners in international waters without intercepting their boats, without any trial or charges. These are extrajudicial executions. And then there is absolutely no legitimacy whatsoever for the U.S. government seizing these foreign oil tankers. And then Trump has actually just come out a few hours ago, and Trump said that the U.S. government is going to keep the Venezuelan crude oil and put that potentially in the U.S. petroleum reserves, the strategic petroleum reserves. And Trump is even talking about keeping these foreign tankers. Many of these tankers, they're actually not even Venezuelan, and the U.S. is now threatening to keep them. This is piracy. There's no legitimacy whatsoever. It is blatantly illegal. As for why the U.S. government is doing this, I think there are multiple different reasons, and I agree with the other guests. But another significant reason is we see in the new national security strategy released by the Trump White House, Trump is bringing back this colonial Monroe Doctrine, and in particular, he's updating it and referencing the old Roosevelt Corollary, which goes to 1904, in which the U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt updated this 1823 doctrine. It's over 200 years old, and Roosevelt famously said that the U.S. government reserves the unilateral right to militarily interfere in all of the countries in Latin America if it serves U.S. interests. So Trump is taking what is essentially a colonial doctrine. They now call it the Trump Corollary. And in the national security strategy, they say that the U.S. wants to seek complete supremacy in the entire Western Hemisphere, which includes control over all of the strategic natural resources and the infrastructure in the region. Of course, Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves. And Trump has claimed that Venezuela's oil and land and other assets belong to the U.S., treating this country, which is independent and sovereign, like a U.S. colony. And the national security strategy also said that the U.S. wants to cut out any foreign powers, especially China, but also Russia and other countries, from having close relations with any countries in Latin America. And Venezuela is a country that has close relations with both China and Russia, as well as with Iran. So the U.S. is trying to destabilize any country in the region that has close ties with these foreign powers and is seeking these strategic natural resources so they can be exploited by U.S. companies.
Well, Ambassador, there's a lot to unpack when it comes to the U.S. policy toward this region. It's like a new version of Monroe Doctrine. You are from this region. You are from Chile. How do people see it's like the renewed version of Monroe Doctrine? The U.S. will somehow dictate the relationship. What kind of relationship the regional countries have with China, with other countries?
Sure. Well, the Monroe Doctrine evokes significant pushback in Latin America. It is read as, America for the Americans, by which is meant America for the United States. Obviously, this doesn't go down very well. It evokes the days of invasions, of gunboat diplomacy that was so predominant in the early part of the 20th century. It really takes us back, 100 years, 200 years, to notions that we thought belonged to the past. Latin America today has diversified its links considerably all across the world. It is part of a globalized, interdependent economy with very strong links with China, with India, with countries around the world. And therefore, the notion that we should be pulled back to what the region was in the early 19th century, it strikes many as totally absurd. To give you only an example, for South America as a whole, its number one trading partner is China. It's not the US, it's not Europe. This is not something that can be somehow undone from one day to the next by some decision of the US government. Latin America is part of the world today. It's open to the world. It trades with the world. It gets investment from the world. And therefore, this is something that will not work. It is an attempt to pull the region back to what it was 200 years ago. And I'm afraid it's very much a failed endeavor. But we're in for difficult times. There's no doubt about that.
Professor Jiang, do you think Washington is, taking Venezuela as an example? Like if you refuse, let's say, to fall in line with this America First doctrine, and you will be punished, and your government will be overthrown. And if you are, for example, having a right-wing government like that in Argentina, you may receive support, financial support from Washington. Is this kind of like a warning to the regional countries?
Yes, you're right that the U.S. wants to send out a kind of a signal. You can be my friend or you will be my enemy. We are now in the year 2025. So China can promote a relationship with any countries in the world, with the US, with Venezuela, or with any other countries in the world. So there is no reason for the US to show any concern or kind of fear about China's relationship with the region. And I have to point out that the US is faced with two major problems for the time being: the so-called illegal migration and the so-called illegal drug trafficking. Now, why there are these kind of two things? Because the economy in Latin America is not well developed. China has been making investment in Latin America. China has been doing trade with the countries in the region. So China's economic relationship with the countries in the region is beneficial for economic growth, for all kinds of things in Latin America. So we can just conclude that a more prosperous Latin America is good for the U.S. Okay, so if the economy is well developed, then there will be less illegal migration. There will be less illegal drug trafficking. So the U.S. should be grateful to China, not afraid of China's relationship with Latin America.
But yeah, I think that's a good point. But Professor, you are thinking in a positive way, right? Yeah, China's investment will create jobs, and people will, find a job like near their home. They will not take this venture to go to the U.S. But what about this, geopolitical thinking, I guess, from Washington, that is like, oh, this is my sphere of influence. I don't want to see influence from China, India, Russia, or any other countries, Do you think that's also a factor in their thinking?
Yes, I would say so. Because, according to the U.S., the region of Latin America is always a backyard of the U.S. Okay, so the U.S. just not so the U.S. just wants to maintain its dominance in its backyard. So whoever wants to have a relationship with the region, the U.S. will be angry. So that's not the kind of game. We are now in the age of globalization. Okay, so mutual dependence, mutual relationship, win-win cooperation is good for everybody, for China, for Latin America, and also for the U.S.
That's right. Ben, if you look at, of course, earlier the ambassador mentioned about domestic concerns, so-called immigration issue, MAGA, the followers, they kind of like, they're forming kind of a pressure on the government, they need to do something. Now they are targeting Venezuela. But people also point out probably the Secretary of State, Rubio, probably plays a role. He's a descendant of Cuban immigrants. And he has obviously no love lost with the Cuban government over there. We know that the oil from Venezuela is also very important to Cuba. There are reports saying that that kind of campaign probably is creating a kind of a collapsing situation in Cuba. What will be the impact on Venezuela, on Cuba, and in the entire region?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that Marco Rubio has dedicated his entire career to pushing for regime change in Cuba, and of course also Venezuela and also Nicaragua. These are the three countries with left-wing governments that the U.S. has targeted with unilateral sanctions in violation of international law and has backed coup attempts repeatedly. And let's not forget, in Venezuela, during Trump's first term, there was another coup attempt in which the U.S. recognized this little-known right-wing opposition politician, Juan Guaido, as the so-called interim president of Venezuela. And then the U.S. and some European countries seized billions of dollars of Venezuelan assets, including the U.S. illegally seized Citgo, which was the most important foreign asset of Venezuela, which is their refinery company. So the U.S. has been, waging this kind of hybrid war against Venezuela for many years. And this isn't just under Trump. This was also under Obama, who started the sanctions against Venezuela. But Trump has really taken it to a whole new level. And now that Marco Rubio is the Secretary of State and Rubio is simultaneously serving as the National Security Advisor, that makes him very powerful. He's the second person in U.S. history after Henry Kissinger to simultaneously hold both positions. And it's clear that Rubio has prioritized, this heavy interventionist policy in Latin America. And by the way, the main right-wing opposition figure in Venezuela, Maria Corina Machado, who's very close to Donald Trump, and she did an interview with Donald Trump Jr., Trump's son, in which Machado pledged that she wants to privatize all of Venezuela's oil, and she offered to sell $1.7 trillion of Venezuelan assets to U.S. companies. Well, she also has repeatedly made it clear in these interviews, including in an interview that Machado did with the Miami Business Forum, where Trump also spoke. Machado was speaking via Zoom. And in that interview, she said that if they can succeed in overthrowing President Maduro in Venezuela, the next goal would be overthrow the governments of Cuba and Nicaragua. So they're not hiding that fact.
They're not hiding that fact. Ambassador, you earlier mentioned the so-called illegal immigrants that somehow creates pressure on the U.S. side. But if there's a land-based attack, if there's a land-based war against Venezuela, that will create more refugees, probably influx into the U.S. Isn't that kind of contradictory there?
Well, of course, absolutely. One of the things that has been on the table, and some people have been arguing for it quite straightforwardly. The former U.S. ambassador to Venezuela, there was an op-ed in the New York Times by Ricardo Hausmann, a Venezuelan economist now with Harvard, arguing quite seriously that a land invasion of Venezuela by the United States would be a bit of a cakewalk, that it would be a bit like the invasion of Panama in 1989, and that it wouldn't be like what happened in Iraq or Libya. This, of course, is nonsense. Venezuela is a country of 30 million people, with vast land extension. There are guerrilla movements in neighboring Colombia. There are lots of armed groups. What you might have, if there is a U.S. land invasion of Venezuela, you might have a situation similar to Libya's. Libya, of course, was invaded by NATO forces in 2011. And today, 15 years later, there's a civil war still going on. So a land invasion of Venezuela might lead exactly to the sort of eternal wars that Mr. Trump campaigned against in 2024. So I think that is one reason the White House until now has been reluctant to undertake that, because the easiest way to effect regime change, of course, is by an invasion. It's very difficult to do from the air or from the sea. But obviously, that would mean a step that would lead the United States exactly into the situation that Mr. Trump denounced in his campaign. So it's very tricky. I think Mr. Trump has painted himself into a corner at this point, and he has no good options.
Ambassador, how do you read his end game here? If not a land-based attack, is his goal? Obviously, I think we all agree. His goal is to have a regime change. But do you think the pressure is the pressure enough, ongoing pressure enough, to create the trouble that somehow will force the change of government in Venezuela?
Well, another option that has been on the table has been targeted bombings of, say, military bases, Venezuelan military bases, or targets that are identified as, drug trafficking centers. But that is obviously a limited thing. You cannot, say, undertake carpet bombing of Caracas like it's happened in Gaza. So that is not, an optimal solution either. So the White House caught, the way I see it, between a rock and a hard place. It doesn't have any good or easy options. They are all bad. And that is why it has resorted to this naval blockade of oil traffic. But that is not something that has an immediate effect. That may take many months. And, political timing being what it is, it's not a very good solution.
Professor Jiang, how do you see, let's say, a prediction of what's going to happen? Trump had this regime change in his mind, but that will be like a prolonged situation before, if there is any possibility for him to achieve his goal, obviously. So the tension will continue for some time?
Well, I would say that the U.S. will not send their ground troops into Venezuela, because Venezuela is a big country. I don't believe that the U.S. troops will take over the whole country and capture Maduro, like the U.S. did in 1989 for the Panama. Yes, your question is very good. So people are asking, what will happen in the next future? Well, I would suggest that probably this kind of illegal sanctions will continue to move forward. And as President Trump suggests the other day, he said that if Maduro is smart enough, he will hand over power to the opposition. I don't believe that Maduro will hand over power, and I also don't believe that the opposition can rule the country. Okay, as you know, this kind of opposition is totally divided, and they even cannot agree on one slogan. So how can the opposition manage the economy of the whole country? So definitely, probably, if the crisis is going on, then people in Venezuela will suffer more, and there will be more chaos and the crisis. So the future is not so good, according to my understanding.
Ben, what about the U.S., like the public response? Do you think people in general are with the government? I think we have to stress that this is without the UN mandate, without the UN authorization, either operations over the sea, striking at the boats, or seizure of oil tankers there.
Well, yeah, let's not forget that when the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, it was also without the mandate of the UN Security Council. So the U.S., has a history of doing these kinds of unilateral illegal actions. In terms of U.S. opinion, public opinion, multiple polls done by both U.S. firms and British firms like YouGov have found that a majority of Americans oppose a U.S. invasion of Venezuela, and a majority of Americans oppose direct military strikes in Venezuela. And there have been large protests going on in multiple U.S. cities. This is not popular. Of course, if you look at the polls, they do fall somewhat on partisan lines. So even though a slight majority of Americans in general, regardless of party affiliation, oppose these attacks. There are more Republicans who support them, but even not as many Republicans as you would think. There still are many Republicans speaking out against Trump. And the irony is that if you look at the so-called MAGA base of Trump, there are some figures who have been very critical of U.S. interventionism and U.S. support, for instance, Israel and the war in Gaza, as well as these strikes in the waters surrounding Venezuela, and talks of Trump said that he's going to carry out strikes on Venezuelan land. We've seen, for instance, that Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's a very right-wing Republican and a longtime Trump supporter, she recently broke with Trump and she's resigning from the Congress. And she has spoken out against these attacks on Venezuela. So even among Trump's own base, there's not this complete unity. And certainly Democrats are criticizing Trump. So I actually think this is not a very popular action. But of course, it's Marco Rubio and it's also Miller. So we see that Stephen Miller is playing another very important role in pushing for these very aggressive attacks in Venezuela. And Miller even claimed on Twitter that Venezuela's oil belongs to U.S. companies because Venezuela nationalized its oil. And, many people in the U.S. have rightfully criticized this and said this is colonial rhetoric. Venezuela's natural resources belong to the people of Venezuela, not to the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ben, if you look at this larger impact internationally, are we in this fragmented world? And are we done? Are we over with this rules-based international order in the U.S.? Basically, the powerful can act as they like.
Well, this whole idea of the so-called rules-based order was always very hypocritical and very ambiguous. This is why, not only China, but many other countries have talked about the importance of the international law-based order centered in the United Nations, which is very concrete. We all know what it means. Whereas Western officials have talked about the rules-based order, and they've never really clarified what exactly they meant. And in many cases, they're the ones who make the rules. In the case of the US, I already talked about the invasion of Iraq, and the ambassador talked about the war in Libya. And there are many other examples, the war in Yemen, the drone strikes in Pakistan, and the invasion of Afghanistan. Of course, the US has carried out many of these unilateral military actions over many decades. So I'm very skeptical of this whole narrative of the rules-based order. But I do think that Trump is unique in the sense that previous US presidents sometimes did lip service, at least they would sometimes talk about international law, even though they often violated it. Whereas Trump doesn't even care about international law. In fact, I think it's the opposite. Trump, he's proud of the fact that he acts unilaterally. And this is why he's so aggressively attacked United Nations institutions. He's withdrawn the U.S. from the UN Human Rights Council and from UNICEF. He's attacked the World Health Organization. He has imposed sanctions on the International Criminal Court. This is part of this strong unilateralism that has always been at the heart of U.S. politics, not just under Republicans, but Trump has really made this part of his personal brand and part of this very far-right politics that has become dominant in Washington today.
Mm-hmm. Well, with the things on the ground, we'll keep an eye on the continuous development over there. And on that, we are coming to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.